Hi, Hall H listeners. Nabus here, and one thing I love about podcasting is being able to connect with and share the stories of incredible people in the pop culture and comic book universe. One such person is the brilliant Silver Age comic book historian, illustrator, author, and fellow graphic designer, Arlen Schumer. This episode was recorded at Palm Springs Comic-Con 2017, just before Arlen was set to give a visual lecture. I enjoyed our conversation that covered meeting his boyhood idol, Neal Adams, at 15 years old, and then working for him 10 years later, which is an important part of Arlen's life since he lost his own father at a young age and considered Neal Adams as a father figure. We also talk about Jim Steranko, another one of his comic book idols that he almost ended up working for as well, our mutual graphic design hero, Saul Bass, why he calls his presentations VisuaLectures, Jack Kirby, Black Panther, the lack of Asian heroes and leading men, and more. If you will be at San Diego Comic Fest 2019, which takes place March 7th through the 10th, you won't want to miss Arlen's 4 visual lectures covering the 50th anniversary of Jim Steranko's Captain America, Steve Ditko, the 60th anniversary of The Twilight Zone, and 50 years of Neal Adams' Batman. Thanks for listening to episode 56 of the Hall H Show podcast, featuring my good friend, Arlen Schumer. And for episode 57, you'll get even more Arlen, as I had the good fortune of sitting down with him for a few hours at San Diego Comic-Con 2018. Enjoy. Welcome to the Hall H Show. We are joined by Arlen Schumer, the great Arlen Schumer, the author of...
Am I really great? Am I great?
The Silver Age of Comic Book Art. It's a book that I picked up at San Diego Comic-Con recently. We are at Palm Springs Comic-Con 2017. Welcome to the show, Arlen.
Thank you, Aaron. Great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, we just got finished with your visual lecture about the 25th anniversary of the animated series, the Batman animated series, and it was incredible.
Thank you.
I was blown away, and like I was blown away at Comic-Con with the Jack Kirby panel, which we will. You're going to do an extended version later.
Well, not
today.
the extended, the actual full version that I've
Yeah.
never been able to do in the handful of times I've done the Kirby lecture this year. Mm-hmm. It's the centennial, so. You know, Kirby's career has such a breadth and span. How you can do something called the Centennial of Jack Kirby in 45 minutes, I knew going into it I would never be able to finish. At San Diego Comic-Con, they're very strict. They give you 45 minutes. So at the end of the 45 minutes, I said to the people, because your decision is either do the whole 90-minute lecture and zip through it in 45 minutes, but that's not fair to the audience. Nobody likes that.
That's true.
So I decided I'm just going to do the first 45 minutes and then throw myself on the mercy of the audience and say, sorry, guys. And that's what I had to do. And people kind of understood. Mm-hmm. And believe me, they got a lot in those 45 minutes. Then I did it for the 92nd Street Y in Manhattan a month ago, very prestigious location. And they were charging people tickets. And yet they only gave me not enough time. And I couldn't even finish there. So God bless Alex Callego and the Palm Springs Comic-Con, because it's a small enough convention that I was able to say to them, can you give me the full time frame that my lectures demand? And they were able to accommodate me, and that benefits the audience. So everybody's going to get the full, for the first time, the full 90-minute Kirby lecture. It'll be videotaped by you and somebody else, so I'll be able to post it later for everybody that couldn't be here. Mm-hmm. So it's a beautiful thing, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm totally looking forward to it, too. You had 2 panels yesterday. Do you want to briefly go through those panels as well?
Yeah, you know, when I told Alex, since you're flying me out here, that you have me for the whole weekend, I'll give you 2 lectures a day, which I've done before at other comic conventions where if you fly me out and put me up, you have me for the whole weekend. And since I love lecturing on what I lecture about, you know, I could do it literally all day long. So I was able to do 1 lecture based on my Silver Age book. And then that was my first lecture. The second lecture was on the 50th anniversary of the entrance into the comic book world of the great Neal Adams, one of my mentors. I worked for him. Mm-hmm. I'm probably the only person honoring the 50th anniversary of him entering the comic field. But to anybody who was there in 1967, I was 9 years old, the impact of Neal Adams in the comic book field was like these special effects movies when the comet hits the Earth and creates that tsunami that destroys everything.
Right.
Kind of what Neal Adams' impact was when he entered the field, probably even greater than Steranko. Steranko's impact was as meteoric and instant, but even Neal's, because Neal had the realism Steranko didn't have. And we all love when our fantasy worlds are made to look real. That's the appeal of all 20th century fantasy pop culture. And all the guys that are making the movies that have made our fantasy worlds real, George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, that generation, they were all teenagers when Neal's impact, and they were all comic book fans. So they've taken what Neal started with superheroes on the printed page and converted it using special effects in the computer in live action film. But the rendering of fantasy worlds and realism, in fact, I even have a spread in my book where I quote Neal Adams where he says, if superheroes really existed, they would have to look like the way I draw them. And that's really true when you look at his early superhero attempts. That's what blew our minds. We had never seen our favorite superheroes, even though they were beautifully drawn by Jack Kirby and Steranko and Carmen Infantino. There was always a kind of implied two-dimensional flatness to them because they were, like Robert Crumb said, lines on paper. Adams, through his incredible visual acuity in inking to make forms look three-dimensional and round, gave these superheroes a depth and a mass that they just never had before. And that blew our collective comic book minds. So yeah, I'm the only one that honored the 50th anniversary of his impact in coming to the field. So that was my second lecture yesterday. And then today, Batman Animated and Jack Kirby.
All right. And going back to Neal Adams, you sort of have a really awesome story of, I guess, when you first saw Neal Adams at a convention long time ago.
So my very first comic convention was the famous Phil Seuling July 4th comic conventions that he had in the mid to late 70s, early 70s, all through the early 80s in New York City. And Phil Seuling was the kind of instigator of the comic book stores in the late 70s, buying comics directly from Marvel and DC, and that's how the comic book whole store system started. And he was the ringleader of the New York convention scene. So these conventions, I was 15 years old in 1973. Adams, that was the summer of the Joker's five-way revenge that we were all waiting years for Neal Adams to give us his version of the Joker after he gave us his version of Batman. But it took, because for years they didn't want to do anything that resembled a TV show. So I'll never forget. So Neal Adams, in those days, early 70s, there were a few comic fanzines that had pictures of him, but very few. We mostly knew what Neal Adams looked like from that great self-portrait he did in 1970 when he won the Academy Award for Comics, the ACBA Award for Best Penciler or something. And he drew this beautiful little self-portrait that I still use in all my presentations. So I'm 15 years old. I'm at my first comic convention, which was a mind-blowing experience to begin with.
Right.
And I round the hallway in the convention, and I see a guy like 20 yards in front of me, and he's looking over my head, trying to like wait for somebody to come to this room where there was obviously a big meeting going on. I found out later it was a meeting of the Academy of Comic Book Arts and Sciences, this early comic book trade group, and Neal Adams was the president that year. So he's outside the room kind of looking over me, hoping somebody waiting for will come into the meeting. And I look at him, and because I was only aware of his face from that self-portrait, not a photograph, I kind of did a double take, and I'm like 10 yards away from him, and imagine, it was like a comic book word balloon above my head. I go, you're Neal Adams, just like that. 15 years old. Anyway, he kind of heard me, and he goes, yeah. And then, he went back to looking. So there were people, there were fans sitting at his feet, literally, with their sketchbooks open, waiting for him to draw something. Me, I felt like, who am I to ask the great Neal Adams to draw? Just give me your signature. And I've never asked for, other than Bruce Springsteen, I've never asked for anybody's signature other than Neal Adams and Bruce Springsteen.
Okay.
Right? And I got both of them. So, and that was my experience. Now, if somebody had told me in 1973, Arlen, 10 years later, 83, you're going to end up working for Neal Adams,
Wow.
I would have had an adolescent heart attack right there, because anybody that is of my age range that was there when Neal Adams' impact was made like a tsunami. And if you were a young budding comic artist, it would be like being a young guitar player and being told that when you get older, you'll back up Jimi Hendrix.
Okay.
Right? So I ended up doing that. I ended up working for Neal Adams, my childhood idol, my role model. I didn't have a father. My father died when I was 4 months old. My mother raised my brother and I herself. But Adams was one of my many pop culture father figures, and I got to work for him.
And how did that opportunity come about?
I was in New York City. I had come out of art school in 1980, 81. I had a few jobs. I did the graphics for the David Letterman show when he was on NBC.
Oh, wow.
The first year the show was on the air. I worked at an advertising agency, and then I got fired from there because I wasn't good at office politics, which I've never been good at. And then, when you're out of work and you're young, that's when you have the courage to show your sketchbook to Continuity Associates, which I knew was in New York City. I knew Neal had the studio. But when you have nothing to lose, you've got the balls at 25 years old to show your sketchbook to Neal Adams. And the very next day, I got a call from Continuity, would you like to come here and work here every day? I said, yeah. And for the first couple months, I had that tingling feeling, standing next to Neal Adams, working for him, like having that out-of-body Doctor Strange ectoplasmic experience.
Right.
Like, I can't believe because again, if you had told me when I was 10 years old that I would one day be working for Neal Adams, ask anybody who was there that if they were told that, they would have had a heart attack. So I'm very fortunate in my life to be able to say I got to work for Neal Adams. And, in the 2 years I worked for him, I knew when I was done with him I'd be able to be on my own, because when you're done working for your father figure, who can you work for? You can't work for another boss. So that gave me also the confidence to know whenever I would be done with Neal, it was like going to graduate school and getting paid for it.
Right.
My drawing improved 400% just by working with him. He taught by example, not as a teacher would teach directly. So he taught by getting your drawing criticized. So you would do a drawing, and it was all advertising art. It wasn't really comics. It was storyboards, animatics, which are limited animation storyboards, comp art. So like every print ad you've ever seen in a magazine had to be kind of sketched out first to sell the idea to the ad agency before they give the agency $20,000 to hire actual photographer to actually shoot it.
Got it.
So we were doing art like that and learning a tremendous amount. And the way you would learn is you do a drawing, you'd show it to Neal, you think you did good, but there was that little spot where you kind of screwed up on. You would show it to Neal, and he had like a laser beam like the Terminator in his eyes. He would shoot right to the part where you screwed up. And that meant that everything else was okay. He never gave anybody a compliment. Him not criticizing your work was the compliment.
Got it.
But you know what? You can get better that way. And it's funny. Neal didn't open up a school like Joe Kubert did.
Okay.
Now, when you look at the alumni of the Joe Kubert School since 1976, it's a pretty prestigious alumni.
Sure.
Not just his sons, of course, but a whole range of people. But when you look also at the people that went through Continuity, which was like a school, but it was an art studio where you got paid, but like a school, everybody from Frank Miller to Bill Sienkiewicz to Mike Nasser to Bob Layton. I mean, I could rattle off names of the artists who have gone through Continuity, of which I am just one of many. But Neal, to his credit, as an indirect teacher, when you list the alumni of Continuity, it's as prestigious as the alumni of the Kubert School.
Wow, that's amazing. I had no idea. And it's like...
You want to know how I almost worked for Steranko?
Sure.
So, how lucky am I to say, not only did I work for Neal Adams, but I almost worked for the other twin god of the late 60s in comics, Jim Steranko. And how did that happen? I'm at Rhode Island School of Design, major in graphic design, from 1976 to 80. So in 1979, I must have sent Steranko a fanboy letter at his Super Graphics address in Reading, Pennsylvania. And I must have been this gushing fanboy letter like, Mr. Steranko, I'm only majoring in graphic design because of you. Because, it was Steranko's graphic design influence, his use of type, is as influential with imagery as his very graphic kind of pop art psychedelic imagery that he created.
Right.
Equally influential. So when I got to RISD, I originally went there because Walt Simonson had come out of there.
Oh, wow.
And I thought I was going to be a comic book artist like every other teenager who loves comics. So I said, if RISD can turn out a guy like Walt Simonson, that's where I want to go. But once I got to RISD, and I did a little research freshman year, it turns out their graphic design department was actually held in higher esteem than the illustration department. And when I learned what graphic design was, the combination of words and pictures, our whole society is words and pictures. Comics are words and pictures. Advertising art, print ads were words and pictures. So I thought I loved advertising. And it turns out, graphic design is really where I could take my comic book. So I ended up majoring in graphic design. Now, ironically, I ended up making my living more as an illustrator, yet I use my graphic design sense in every line I make. And that is to the credit of the great education I got at RISD. So it's 1979. I'm a junior. I must have written Steranko this gushing fanboy letter about how I'm really in graphic design because of your influence. And again, pre-computer, pre-everything, he must have written back to me inviting me to Reading for a day to meet with him. I got on a bus from Providence, Rhode Island to Reading, Pennsylvania. I don't remember much of the day that I spent with Steranko in his townhouse studio. Because, again, I think I had an ectoplasmic Doctor Strange out-of-body experience. But what I do remember is that he asked me, would I leave RISD and come to work for him as his apprentice?
This reminds me of Neil deGrasse Tyson recounting his first time he met Carl Sagan, when Carl Sagan was trying to get him.
Yes. Okay, so I remember taking the bus ride back to Providence, like the final scene in The Graduate, where your whole life is in front of you and that bus at the end. And I felt like, wow, what do I do? Do I stay in school? I was a junior. Get my degree. My mother, God bless her, may she rest in peace, she was paying for school along with student loans. And do I stay in school? Or do I leave school and join the circus and be Jim Steranko's apprentice? What do you think I did?
I think you did the other way, the other route.
What?
You went the other route. You didn't go with Steranko.
I stayed in school. If I was a freshman and Steranko had asked me to leave school, maybe. But I felt I was already a junior. I had one more year to go. My mother was paying for school. I couldn't just say, hey, Mom, I'm leaving school to work for Jim Steranko.
Yeah.
She might have said, like she was very easy. She might have said, Arlen, whatever makes you happy. But I did stay in school, and I remained friends with Steranko ever since when I see him at conventions. So he's another kind of father figure to me. But once again, how lucky am I to be able to say that I not only got to work for Neal Adams, but I almost got to work for Jim Steranko, my two greatest influences in my own art and design. And so, yeah, I'm very, very blessed and lucky to be able to say that.
Yeah, I consider
pretty good story, though, huh?
That is an awesome story. And going back to your graphic design influences, I'm a graphic designer as well.
Yeah.
And when you talk about words and pictures and how it can help communicate ideas, like for me, my first spark into graphic design, even though I didn't know what graphic design was at the time, was watching West Side Story. And Saul Bass's beginning.
Watching the what?
West Side Story.
Oh, yeah.
With Saul Bass's.
Absolutely, one of the great influences. Yeah.
So, as a kid, I was so drawn to that. So
pun intended.
Yeah, exactly.
Drawn.
So, you're the first person that got that influence.
I'm an inveterate punster. Are you kidding me?
So each time when West Side Story would come on, I love Natalie Wood, but also watched it because
he did the opening credits to Vertigo with the eye. That's Saul Bass.
Yeah.
Oh, Saul Bass is one of my favorites. Absolutely. Well, you can't be a fan or a student of 20th century graphic design of any type and not know and love Saul Bass's work.
Yeah, and I think your experience as a graphic designer sort of helps you communicate
Absolutely.
your what you want to talk about when it comes to comic book art.
Well, because my visual, it's funny. The word lecture is such a pejorative. It's so negative. Everybody hears the word lecture. First of all, it sounds like you're being lectured to. So right away, the word lecture is a negative. Everybody remembers sitting through a boring lecture with slides, clunk, clunk. And yet there's no other substitute word. If you say, I'm going to do a presentation could just be hanging a bunch of paintings. It could be purely two-dimensional. So when I looked at the word lecture, and yet what I do is so visual. I spend so much time on the images, but it is words and pictures. It's me and my voice is the text and the picture. So I thought the word visual lecture, the word visual ends in an L, the word lecture begins with an L. So I thought, I can create a kind of a compound word, visual lecture. It's the best I could do to kind of brand what I do, to let people know that it's not just, a boring slide lecture.
You're known for your outstanding knowledge about the Silver Age comic books and just comic book history in general.
Yeah.
But you're also known, I guess you're also interested in the Twilight Zone and
Yes.
Bruce Springsteen. You sort of want to touch on that a little bit? Because I think our audience would like to know about that as well.
It's kind of like when you talk about if you have children. I have 3 children that I love equally, in addition to my real daughters that I have. But my artistic children, I love equally. And depending on the venue and where I'm at and who I'm talking to, I can switch easily from my love of the Twilight Zone that I did a coffee table book on, that I happen to have right here, with a little Saul Bass in it, by the way, that I'll show you later.
Sweet.
And I did, when you go to my website, there's a Bruce Springsteen icon. You'll see the work I did there. So the interesting thing is that I've been able to relate my 3 loves thematically. Bruce Springsteen is kind of like the superhero of rock and roll. He's got, like Captain Marvel, he's got the lyrics of Dylan with the voice of Roy Orbison and the wall of sound like Phil Spector.
Okay.
And I actually got to illustrate Bruce as Captain America, holding his guitar like Captain America's shield for the fan magazine Backstreets, that's been around for 30 plus years, on the 10th anniversary Born in the USA. I've written essays. Like I said, you go to my website, it's right there. And then Twilight Zone influenced me as a kid, again, like a whole generation did. And I ended up not only doing a coffee table book on the Twilight Zone and some other projects that are all posted on my site, but I found a way to relate the fact that the Twilight Zone was not only influenced by comics, the EC comics of the 50s, that's Serling, who was a paratrooper in World War II, and all the soldiers read comics. And Serling was a fan of fantasy and science fiction. I guarantee you he read those EC comics. And the point is some of those great Twilight Zone episodes play like 30-minute adaptations of some of the great EC science fiction stories with the twist endings.
Yeah. Speaking of Twilight Zone, you mentioned Burgess Meredith in
Yes.
your lecture. And then
He's in many great 4 Twilight Zone episodes.
well, he's in the one that I think I love the most is the one
Time Enough at Last or The Obsolete Man?
the one where he loses his glasses.
Time Enough at Last.
Yeah, that one.
First season episode. One of the great pessimistic endings of Serling. He had a more optimistic worldview than that, but that's probably because it was an adaptation of a short story that he did not write. Some of the greatest Twilight Zone episodes feature Serling's ability as an adapter of material. And some of the greatest episodes, like Time Enough at Last, are Serling scripts that he adapted from great science fiction, fantasy, or horror stories, in addition to writing original episodes for the Twilight Zone. But that's one of Serling's great talents. Look, Kubrick took a short story called The Sentinel by Arthur C. Clarke and gave us 2001.
Okay.
Right?
Right.
So the art of adaptation is an art. This is why the Oscars give Best Adapted Screenplay, because writing a screenplay based on a book is as creative as writing an original screenplay. They've got 2 different awards.
That's a good point. Now, going forward, you had mentioned on the Hangout earlier today that you have a few new visual lectures lined up for 2018.
Right. In the same way my 2017 lectures, the 3 main ones, played off of 2002 anniversaries. 25th anniversary Batman Animated, 50th of Neal entering the field, and Kirby Centennial. I looked at 2018 a couple months ago. Gee, what should I put together to honor that year? Because conventions like the San Diego Comic-Con, they choose which programming a lot based on what that anniversary year is, and they try to choose presentations, lectures, that are based on those anniversaries. That kind of puts you in front of the line. So I looked at 2018. First, in terms of Kirby, there's going to be the Black Panther movie. And I did a verbal visual essay on the origin of Jack Kirby's Black Panther. Because, again, Stan Lee comes in after the fact with all of Kirby's creations. I do not believe Stan Lee created anything on his own. That's a subject, as you know, for a whole nother subject and podcast. But I'll do a presentation lecture based on the verbal visual essay I did to show people how Jack Kirby created the Black Panther and why he should be fully exposed as a black man and not wear that complete hooded mask, which is really a racist mask that he was forced to wear in the mid-'60s because of the Southern distributors who would not accept a black superhero on the cover of their magazines.
So I guess before we move on to your other visual lectures that you have planned, now that we're on this subject, how do you feel the portrayal of Iron Fist?
You know, I'm not that much into Iron Fist. I never read the comic. I was never a fan. I know they chose a white character to play an Asian character. You know, it's really kind of ironic because The Walking Dead, for instance, they killed off that Asian what's his name?
Glenn.
Do you know the actor's name? I forget.
Steve.
He was the
Steve
lead
Ewan.
Asian guy. What was his name on the show?
Glenn. It was Glenn?
Glenn.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not Asian. I'm a white Jewish kid from Fair Lawn, New Jersey, right? But I'm looking at this Glenn, and I'm going, okay, he might have. I didn't read Walking Dead, the graphic novel, so I know that some things they changed. So they had the ability to not kill off Glenn.
Yeah, they did.
And I'm watching this, and I'm going, poor Asians. How many role models do they have? Jackie Chan is getting old. Bruce Lee's dead. You finally have an Asian male lead. And they kill him off. Now,
I'm with you.
There's always behind the scenes. Maybe he's got some TV series planned. I don't know.
I mean, he did. He's a voice on Voltron, the Netflix series.
Boy schmoys. My point is, we need more Asian leading men. And if you talk to Asians, I guarantee you, I feel their pain. And I'm saying where. So my point is, if Iron Fist is supposed to be Asian in the comics, God forbid you have an Asian lead. But as we all know, in movies and in television, the same thing happened with Scarlett Johansson when she was the Ghost in the Machine.
Right.
They were pissed off at that. Listen, Joseph Wiseman was Dr. No. He was a Jewish actor, a white guy playing an Asian Dr. No in 1962. And they had to give him makeup to give him slant eyes. But that was what was done in those days.
Right.
Is that, and yet, the fact that it's still being done, but I'm sure they have their reasons, and it's probably all comes down to economics. They probably have all their bean counters telling them through focus groups that an Asian male lead will not bring in enough of an audience to make the thing profitable. I can only assume that's the reason. I have no idea. You really got to talk to Hollywood insiders, and it's something they don't want to admit. Can Daniel, whatever his name is, can he open up a movie? Can he be the lead in Iron Fist? I don't know, but I guarantee you that's the reason, is that it comes down to money. Scarlett Johansson, they were told that if they put her in the lead of Ghost in the Machine, which ironically ended up bombing,
Right.
probably they were told she will guarantee us a box office that if we put an Asian female lead, and by the way, can you name Asian female leads on one hand? Good luck. Lucy Liu. Who's that? Michelle Yeoh. I'm saying you probably have the same problem where they're all great actresses. They should be on paper playing the leads of these things, but I'm sure the way Hollywood works, when Harvey Weinstein's not molesting you, is that they're telling you that, you know, they just financially, we can't make it work unless we have a white, more well-known actor.
Yeah, I mean, and all the while they're trying to push their ideas of trying to put a giant robot spider into a movie.
Put it this way. They'll have an Asian as the best friend. They'll have a black person as the guy that gets killed. Yeah. It goes back to Star Trek. You know, the people in the red shirt are going to die. So they try their best to give all minorities like the second lead or the best, you know what I mean? But in the end, very rare that you get a minority lead. You know, again, you count them on one hand. Denzel Washington, you know, Jamie Foxx, I don't know. But, you know, very hard because we still live in a segregated racist. Like, look at the world we live in. Mm-hmm. We still are separated by race, and it's sad. And it affects our American popular culture, unfortunately.
Unfortunately. I guess we can sort of go back to your other visual lectures that you have planned for 2018.
Oh, yeah. So after the Black Panther, it's funny. I did 2017 is the 50th anniversary of Neal Adams entering the field.
Right.
But next year will be the 50th anniversary of Neal Adams giving us what I believe, and many people agree with me, the definitive comic book Batman. It really begins in 1968 with one single issue in the summer, only 3 months after the TV show left the air. Neal Adams in one issue where Batman meets Deadman, who was the character that made Neal's bones, kind of like what Manhunter did for Walt Simonson, is what that did for Neal Adams, Deadman. So by teaming up Deadman with Batman in one issue, overnight, he gives us the Dark Knight of today. Because an 11-year-old Frank Miller was reading that issue, just like the rest of us were. And that helped give an entire generation the idea for a series. Michael Uslan in 1968 was 18 years old, and he ends up getting the rights to do the Batman films and treat Batman seriously because of what Neal Adams did to Batman. So I'll put together a lecture on the 50th anniversary of Neal Adams' Batman.
Okay.
And then my third lecture dovetails with that. You know, you're going to see about 50 documentaries next year on the anniversary of the year 1968, mostly from a political, cultural angle, because it was such a year of upheaval. The assassinations, the Democratic Convention, Vietnam. 1968 is one of the most portentous, pregnant years in American history. Well, I looked at it from a comic book perspective because I was 10 years old in 1968, you know, only hearing about Vietnam on TV. But what a year for comic book art it was. I started to look at just the artists in my Silver Age book and what they were doing. So you have Neal Adams debuting Batman. You have, let's say, Jack Kirby, still in his prime, giving us that great FF annual with the birth of Franklin Richards and his last great villain, Annihilus. Mm-hmm. You have Jim Steranko at his absolute peak, giving us those incredible S.H.I.E.L.D. stories and the, you know what I mean, in 1968. You have Gil Kane giving us one of the first graphic novels, Savage. Steve Ditko jumps to DC and gives us The Creeper and Hawk and Dove, which are still characters DC is using. While, you know, every great artist, both the newcomers and sort of the old-timers, Joe Kubert does Enemy Ace, which might be his greatest single body of artwork, and he does that in 1968. So I'm going to put together a lecture spotlighting 1968, not the year in politics, not the year in culture, the year in comics. Right. And what a great year it was.
Yeah, I guess I'm looking forward to those.
Yeah, it'll be great.
What was your first comic book that you remember reading?
I went to summer camp when I was very young, sleepaway camp. And my mother was a widow, so she heard the advice of her friends and relatives. You should send the boys, me and my brother, to sleepaway camp where they'll get some father figures like the counselors. Well, I didn't really think of the counselors as father figures, but the father figures I discovered in summer camp were the superheroes in the comic books that in those days were strewn over the bunks. All different types of comics, Marvels, DCs, Archie, all that. But it was the superhero comics that I remember jumped out at me. And the very first comic I can recall seeing the cover of was the great Superman annual 1963 with the black and white wash tone drawing of Superman as a silver statuette penciled by the great Kurt Swan, who we didn't even know his name at the time because DC didn't credit their artist, with wash tones by DC color artist Jack Adler, Howard Stern's cousin, who ended up bringing comics home for Howard Stern, which is why Howard Stern is such a big comic book fan.
Oh, wow.
So, and if you know that cover, it's one of the greatest Superman covers, one of the greatest single illustrations of Superman ever done. And that was my first comic book cover. Mm-hmm. And I kind of show that the last page of my autobiography. Yeah. The last page of my Silver Age book is a one-page autobiography, and there's me reading that Superman cover, that Superman comic. That's me in summer camp in 1964, a year later, and I've got the comic at my feet. That's a postcard I sent back to my mother from summer camp. Other kids said, send money, send candy. I send her a picture of Superman. That's me in 8th grade doing an oral report on the lawsuit between Superman and Captain Marvel that I read about in Steranko's History of Comics. So while other kids are giving oral reports on who knows what, I was always trying to figure out all through school, up into college, how to work comics into my assignments. So that's me in 8th grade. And then I end it by a quote that a friend gave me, an artist friend of mine, about 15 years ago. And they said, Arlen, this quote is you. And I've been using that quote to end many of my presentations. And I know it by heart. It's by the great existentialist writer Albert Camus, who wrote The Stranger. And he said, a man's work is nothing but the slow trek to rediscover through the detours of art those 2 or 3 great and simple images in whose presence his heart first opened.
Wow.
Are you kidding me? I read that. I'm like, what the? That is me, and that is really all of us. When you think about it, if you're a musician, it's sometimes that first song you hear as a kid that stays with you your whole life. I remember the first song I recognized, Big Girls Don't Cry by the Four Seasons. I thought their lyrics were Big Girls Small Fry. Because, you know, when you're a boy and you're a kid, the girls are taller,
yeah.
Right? Makes sense, Big Girls Small Fry.
Uh-huh.
I remember the first movie I saw, Sean Connery and Dr. No at a drive-in theater. My first visual image is Connery as Bond, and I didn't have a father.
Right.
All of a sudden, Connery becomes my father figure. And then my first television image is the Twilight Zone eyeball hanging in outer space.
Wow.
So look at what I ended up doing in my career. I'm a major James Bond Connery fan. I put together a coffee table book proposal that I don't think will ever get done. But the point is I love the Connery Bond. I became a Twilight Zone aficionado. And, you know, the comics I saw, I ended up becoming like a whole generation. An illustrator, comic book style artist. So I'm not alone.
Yeah.
A whole generation exists of people like me.
So with your wealth of knowledge about comic book history, if there was a Mount Rushmore of comic book creators, what 4 people would be on there for you?
Well, you know, I would put probably the 4 most iconic superheroes. So it's got to be Superman and Batman. They're the yin yang. You have to have Wonder Woman to represent the greatest female icon. And then, even though Wonder Woman was not an influence on me, I would honor her if we're going to do Mount Rushmore. And then Captain America, because superheroes were tied in with American ideals, partly what my Silver Age book is about. In World War II, they fought a proxy war against the Axis and Hitler. And then in the 60s, they kind of were like the Kennedy administration trying to save the world. And then, you know, Vietnam destroyed all that.
Right.
And that's why you get the relevance of Green Lantern, Green Arrow. So it would be, Superman, Batman, Captain America, and Wonder Woman are the 4 great superhero icons.
What about creators?
Wow, that's a little harder. So, yes, you have to have Kirby, of course. Then after Kirby, you know, it gets tricky because you have to have Will Eisner on there, father of the graphic novel and what he did in his career. Eisner's like the D.W. Griffith of comics, meaning what D.W. Griffith did for film, where he innovated all the tools of film, the dissolve, the pan shot, all the vocabulary of film is attributed to D.W. Griffith. Even though he made that racist film Birth of a Nation, that's a whole nother story. But as a filmmaker, he innovated all the tropes of film that we accept. So he's got to be there, Will Eisner. He did that in comics. Then after that, it gets tricky. Who created entire universes? If you're going to talk about great artists, like Neal Adams, I believe belongs in there, but many people would disagree. Look at an artist like Mobius. Mobius created literally a universe of characters and a style. even though emotionally his work, I was too old by the time his work appeared to get as emotionally connected, I respect Mobius as a creator on the level of Kirby, because like Kirby, they created entire worlds. The only other artist I would put in that league would be Robert Crumb, because if you look at the range of Crumb's work, he not only documented the counterculture, which he's still doing 50 years later, but he documented his interior world like no other artist has ever bared his soul. And he's the cartoonist of our times, and he's got a style as identifiable as Mobius, Eisner, and Kirby. So I believe those, off the top of my head, are the four greatest comic creators of the 20th century. But then after that, it starts to get, I think Steranko belongs in there. I think Adams, Kubert belongs in that list, because you look at the range of his work. I mean, so many genres. Do you know Kubert has the third largest amount of comic book covers after Jack Kirby and Kurt Swan?
I did not know that.
Kubert. And not just war covers. He did some of the great JLA covers are by Kubert.
Oh, wow. Didn't know that.
He was a great superhero artist when he decided to do superheroes.
He's known for predominantly like Sergeant Rock stuff, right?
That's what I mean. You would think, but he did Hawkman, he did Ragman, he did Enemy Ace. My point is, he did almost as many covers as Kurt Swan. So Kubert is a giant, But like I said, I think in terms of creating an entire world, it's tough to beat out the guys I mentioned. Kirby, Mobius, Eisner, and Crumb.
Speaking of Kirby, and I'm going to sort of tie this into what's, the evolution of today's Comic Cons. I think I may have heard you say it, but Kirby says something about his experience at the first Comic Con, and how he was saying that he would become a pop culture phenomenon.
Kirby was a visionary, like all the greats are.
Yeah.
And there are interviews from 1969, 1970, where he not only saw the formats of comics becoming sophisticated and hardcover, which is what he really wanted the New Gods and all that to be. And Europe at the time, I don't really know my European comic history like other people do. I don't know what they were doing in the late 60s in terms of hardcovers or whether Kirby was exposed to that. But he saw not only that comics would be treated better and better printed and better editions, but he foresaw comics eventually getting out to the wider culture and influencing movies and television. So he foresaw comic conventions eventually, because I think in the early San Diego Comic Cons, when they were in the basement of the El Cortez Hotel in 1969, 70, 71, some of the young organizers said, let's have something about movies. And some of the comic book people were like, no, let's keep it just about comics. And
right.
Kirby stepped in and said, no, you've got to have these other American pop culture art forms here, because comics affect them and are affected by them.
There you go.
And that's why he foresaw. Now, here's, of course, the irony is that comics are often the smallest part of these conventions. The San Diego Comic Convention, I used to help out the Jack Kirby Museum booth, which was the size of this table we're sitting at.
Okay.
In the giant San Diego Comic Con, which is like 3 football fields put together, right?
Right.
What people walk by, and they have no idea who Jack Kirby is. They don't know that this is the house that Kirby built, because he gave his imprimatur and influence to those early decades of the San Diego Comic Convention before he died in 1994, and helped build it up into what it became. And yet, people don't even forget about Yaakov Kurtzberg, his real name. People think Stan Lee is now also the artist of the Marvel Comics Foundation universe. So my point is, it's bittersweet and it's sad that, do people even know the name Jack Kirby anymore? Look, Infantino died in 2013. Howard Chaykin, the great artist and writer, made a comment that he was at a convention, also in California, the weekend Infantino died, and he never heard the name mentioned once throughout the entire convention.
Wow.
Joe Kubert died in 2012. And who remembers Joe Kubert? So I've taken it upon myself at this late age of my life to become the curator of the Silver Age. No, like I said, is anybody else honoring Neal Adams' entrance to the comic book field 50 years ago? No, me. I will continue to honor, and I will be the curator of the Silver Age because I believe that the artists in my book, Adams, Kirby, Infantino, Ditko, Steranko, Colin, you name it, are going to be our Renaissance masters of the human figure. The way we look back 500 years ago to great artists of the human figure like Michelangelo and Da Vinci and Raphael, I really believe future art historians or aliens are going to look back on our Renaissance masters like Infantino and Kirby, and maybe they'll unearth my book from under all that atomic rubble, and they'll say, wow, this guy Arlen Schumer knew what was going on at the time.
Well,
and maybe my book will become a self-fulfilling prophecy where the way I treated these men by printing their signatures like the great I mean, even their signatures are visual icons, every single one of them. And I treated them like this to kind of visually make my statement that these are our great artists of our time. So hopefully it'll become a self-fulfilling. Look, I also do a lecture on the relationship between fine art and comic book art, where I show Michelangelo's Pietà right next to Kirby's Pietà, with Odin holding a fallen Thor in his arms. Now, I take what I call the alien's perspective. That if the aliens saw those two images, unburdened by 500 years of art history telling them that one was great and one sucked, which is essentially what the fine art world mostly still thinks of comics.
Right.
I think aliens will say, hey, two interesting depictions of an Earth parent mourning their dead child. You know what I mean? Nothing wrong with that.
So what do you think about the new Thor movie, Ragnarok?
About what?
What did you think about Thor Ragnarok?
You know, I enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too.
You know, I'd like to see it again. I've liked, I think all the Marvel movies have been pretty faithful, more than the DC movies, other than Wonder Woman, to the comic book versions. I kind of miss Thor's helmet, but, you know, once again, they go around in these movies without masks that they should be wearing. You know, Hawkeye has a cool medieval purple and blue kind of iron-studded outfit that if Zack Snyder were directing Hawkeye, you'd be getting that Hawkeye costume. Instead, he's a guy in a black, you know, turtleneck with a bow and arrow.
Yeah.
That ain't Hawkeye.
Right.
So, yeah, it bums me out that a lot of these superheroes that should have these visual icons. Now, he should be walking out of the room right now. But no, it's because babies... This is like the Twilight Zone episode, It's a Good Life, where they're all in fear of the child who's going to destroy them.
Well, we're sort of talking about this earlier.
Sorry to break the fourth wall.
No, we're sort of already talking about this beginning before the podcast about how Comic-Cons have changed throughout the years.
Yeah. Well, so the downside of all that success is, unfortunately, what I've noticed the last couple of years of conventions is that largely families are coming to these events because they've seen the movies, so they dress up or whatever. They think it's all about dressing up. But the worst aspect is that they think conventions are like zoos or like visiting the gardens, where it's a family outing and you just walk around and stare. Oh, look at the funny people. They don't know that this is a thing of commerce where people here are selling their works to try to make a living. And these families, by and large, don't understand that you're supposed to be supporting artists and buying something. You got the money.
Which is one reason why we tried to flip the script when we got HallH.com. And instead of covering Hall H, we're covering Artist Alley.
Right. How ironic. Yeah. But listen, there should be everything. But I'm just saying, and I've talked to some vendors, and yeah, it's like sales are down because people are gawking and not buying. And, you know, in addition to not knowing that these movie characters have comic book backgrounds, like they have no clue.
Right.
So it's really, you know, that's the downside to, this is the stuff we dreamed about when we were kids. You know, it's funny. I come from an age where there was one convention a year. Now, on any given weekend in the New York area, there's 3 conventions going on.
Right.
And sometimes you have to choose. Should I go to this convention in White Plains or this one in Long Island or this one in Manhattan?
Do you think the whole convention scene has sort of reached critical mass? And
Well, again, what do you do? Like, I think a year ago, the San Diego Comic Fest was on the same weekend as another convention in San Diego, and they conflicted, and it drew the audience away. What do you do? I don't know, but all these organized. In other words, it's not a win-win. It's a lose-lose for everybody when you have all that competition. Nobody wins because the audience is getting siphoned and sapped. And yet at the same time, there seems to be this demand for more conventions. So I don't know. I'm not in that economic aspect of the whole medium. I focus on the art and the history. I don't really know about those kind of mechanics of things, but it always comes down to money, and But listen, it's a blessing. But like every blessing, anytime anything gets popular, there's always a downside to popularity.
Yeah, I guess we'll have to talk to Rob Sakowitz to learn a little bit more about the business side of pop culture, right?
Yeah, save that for your next guest.
So going forward, you have your visual lectures coming up in 2018. I know you're preparing in about half an hour for your final one here at the
Right,
Pasadena.
I got to eat my pizza.
Yeah, so we'll
begrudgingly.
We'll wrap up this podcast, but I really appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Aaron, man, you're like my biggest fan. Where have you been all my life? Thanks for having me on so many times. I appreciate you plugging me on Facebook all the time.
Sure.
So listen, I really am honored and blessed by you just giving me all this time. So anytime moving forward in the future, you want me as a guest, I'll always be available to you.
Cool.
And just keep covering me. I love it. It's great. And, you really give me a boost knowing that I have people in my, what I call the Arlen Army, that I can count on, for support. So thanks, man.
That's why we're here, to help support people like you.
I love it, man. Thank you so much.
We support your why and your mission.
You got it.
Is there anything else that you would like
to
our
tell
audience
people,
about?
come to my website, arlenschumer.com. Make sure they spell my name right, ARLENSCHUMER.
You're the unknown Schumer, right?
I'm the Amy Schumer, Chuck Schumer, and then there's Arlen Schumer. It'd be nice if I can kind of siphon off some of that fame, but whatever. But yeah, through my website, it's linked to my YouTube channel with a lot of my videos. It's also linked to my Tumblr and Twitter and Facebook. And Facebook friend me, join my groups, email me, any of that stuff.
Cool. Will do. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Aaron, and Hall H.
All right. Peace. Cheers. Talk to you later. Thank you so much for listening to this Hall H Show podcast episode featuring my good friend, the brilliant pop culture and comic book historian and fellow graphic designer, Arlen Schumer. Don't forget to check out the next episode, which features an even longer conversation that I had with him at San Diego Comic-Con 2018. This one is a very powerful and moving episode and a San Diego Comic-Con moment that I'll always remember. You can find the Hall H Show podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, Spotify, and our website, hallh.com. If you believe in our mission to be the voice of independent creators, we would really appreciate a rating, hopefully 5 stars, and a comment on iTunes. And please spread the word on social media using the hashtag HallHShow. Peace, cheers, and please make it a point to visit Artist Alley at all the conventions you plan on going to this year.